I've been deliberately avoiding talking about the technical aspects of the game since they're, well, not much different from Killzone 2. The graphics are still amazing, the sound's genuine and brilliant, and everything else, so consider this the least important part of the review if you like. Pre-patched Killzone 2 for me had the loading times right. Each area would stream off the disc, and pretty much of the time the game would not pause in the slightest, completely immersing you in the action all the more. Post-patched Killzone 2 no longer did this, having an irritating second or so pause as the rest of the area loaded in. Killzone 3, on the other hand, if you watch all of the cutscenes that don't look like cutscenes, you get basically no loading times. If you skip, you'll have to wait, and if you dare load a level that isn't the next one, you'll be greeted by an extraordinarily long loading screen, with no Killzone 2 style hologram to play with. It uses the technique of loading the level behind the cutscene, but rather than the cutscenes be movie quality, they're made to look much like the in-game graphics. Which is odd, since despite the fact that they're pre-rendered, they have terrific screen tearing in them and slowly go out of sync if you're in the wrong screen mode. You know what the solution is? Let us install the game. Make it optional to keep the game's media happy if you must, but the hard drive is there for a reason. Graphics-wise, there isn't a huge amount of difference, but it is there. Killzone 2 looks dark, bleak, smoky, and is hugely post-processed, while Killzone 3 is brighter, more saturated, cleaner looking, and as mentioned earlier has some gorgeously detailed textures. In other words, whilst I'm sure that in a technical sense Killzone 3 is better, it doesn't look very Killzone, and so despite the technical considerations, Killzone 2 still manages to look better in terms of atmosphere and feel, especially the explosions. Besides which, Killzone 3 obviously has to make compromises for the split screen and stereoscopic 3D. Both games have full body awareness, so it seems like Call of Duty can't hold back every shooter, thank goodness. Strangely, Killzone 3 has a problem where you hit the edges of things you're trying to shoot over, but I can't figure out why since Killzone 2 doesn't have the same problem, but I'm guessing it will be patched in time anyhow. Let's talk about some of those extra features. First of all, the stereoscopic 3D. It didn't work very well on mine since it isn't connected to a television that does this particular type of stereoscopic signal. I feel like I'm missing very, very little. There were complaints about input lag in Killzone 2. It's marginally less so in this game. Personally, I never thought it made any difference since this is Killzone, not Call of Duty, Unreal Tournament or some other fast-paced Twitch-die shooter. That's not a criticism of that type of game, there is room for both Twitch-die shooters and slower, more attrition-esque affairs. Split screen is fun, but has the same problems many implementations of split screen do. Where are the options? What are we using the extra screen estate for? How come I can never change the layout in these games? I could have wanted a horizontal split, or a vertical split without black bars in a smaller viewing area. I may have even wanted the black bars, but have all of my HUD elements shifted to that area so they don't get in the way of my smaller view. It was, though, still tremendous fun, even if developers do need to think more about their co-op implementation. Like, where's the 4-player console-to-console version? Why can't I jump in and out? Can't they play Haze first? More on that in a second. It's a shame too, because Natko is the second player, and I quite enjoyed Natko in the last game. He was the resident badass with the terrible mom jokes who finally gets serious later on, yet still tells terrible mom jokes. He's completely silent in this one for some reason. I'd put it down to the co-op implementation entirely, if it wasn't an overall problem with the lack of important, humanising, contextual banter betwixt the game's characters. The glitches in split screen will hopefully be patched out, as it really stands out as the part of the game with least polish. But yes, I really wish game developers would play Haze. Whilst Haze is frankly not the best of games, it did do multiplayer exceptionally well. You start a campaign that is capable of multiplayer, and at any point, other players may join you, either over the network or locally, should you allow it, without any restrictions you don't choose for yourself. In contrast, Killzone 3, you have to start a co-op campaign, and then the other local player has to be with you at all time. It could have been done more like Haze, although it would have made more sense with Killzone 2's setup, as Killzone 3 has mostly yourself and Rico. And Natko if you're playing split screen, who isn't really in the game since, despite being the demolitions expert, says nothing and lets Rico do everything Sev doesn't, including stuff you'd expect a demolitions man to do. A terrible shame when Natko actually has some of the most amusing soldier-type banter in the last game. Killzone's move support is reportedly quite good, so I did have a reasonably long go before switching back to the normal controller. There are several things that I personally find irritating about the Move controller. It begins quite quickly with the calibration. A few games tell you to point the motion controller at the TV, and most of the others tell you to point it at the camera. But I want to end up aiming at the TV, not the camera. I've taken to doing that anyway, since it seems to work just as well, if not better. I've also taken to holding the motion controller at an angle so that the trigger feels more natural and my wrist doesn't point forward quite so much. Luckily, the PlayStation seems to take all of this in its stride, which makes for a versatile controller that's great to pick up and play. But then, so's a light gun. In fact, this is what I keep coming back to, whether it is with the Wiimote, the PlayStation Move, or to an even lesser extent, Kinect. Yes, the technology of yesteryear worked better for 90% of the applications these controllers are supported for. Better because it tracks the screen and not to a camera and doesn't magnify horizontal sensitivity. Even with PlayStation Move, you can set how much it moves rather than just track the screen. The damn thing just doesn't shoot where you point it. So you can aim very accurately, just not by luck. You have to get the feel of it down too. It doesn't help that all of these controllers have a quite significant lag to them, a real noticeable problematic one, not like when people usually complain about input lag. The PlayStation Move has this problem to a much lesser extent, but it is very assuredly not one-to-one motion. That aside, back to Killzone 3 specifically. The motion controller works in the game to shoot guys on screen and taken to the edges turns your view. The not explained options for the motion controller are baffling, but it becomes clear what they're for and what they do after a brief play around. The percentage style systems add an extra layer to the confusion, where when you have turn speed set to 0%, you can still turn. Anyhow, it feels a little like cheating using the motion controller, a little like using a mouse and keyboard for a game you've played on a console. Speaking of which, why not just support the mouse and keyboard? I'll bet they're a hell of a lot easier to include in the game than PlayStation Move. It helps that you can turn off all of the helper modules to create a fairer game. The main advantage touted, aside from being more intuitive, is to increase the immersion. But this isn't really accomplished except in terms of the melee stabbing motion, which is quite fun. I'm sure the sharpshooter slash hunk of plastic gun attachment would help. The Move controls feel tacked on, even more so than Heavy Rain's did, which is odd considering that Killzone 3 was released with Move support already built in. The smaller problem would be that it can make the weapons of the game glitch through the scenery. Actually, I think they've tried too hard to accommodate the motion controller as a device mostly for new players with its little helper functions. I reckon the best motion control player could quite possibly beat the best traditional controller player. But I suspect that if the motion controller player has a lapse in concentration, the consequences would be far worse. It is certainly more tiring. If you're used to the DualShock control pad, you're better off sticking to that unless you really want to retrain yourself. Point is, though, that it really is a viable alternative. A bit of a shame it's unsupported in split screen. Sounds in Killzone 3 have a far greater dynamic range, with no way to narrow the range in game, which makes the voices too quiet. I mean, I suppose you can turn them down as a separate channel, but it isn't ideal. As a bonus, it supports high quality DTS. It isn't unusual for a game to be lacking dynamic range options, so it's not really a detriment to Killzone 3 specifically. On the other hand, it is unusually loud, so make of it what you will. Killzone 2 has a narrower range, but does seem to do environment adjustments better. The echo on your gun's report in the Hellgast factory in Killzone 2 is excellent, as are the sounds of your external walking armour, which is lacking depth in Killzone 3. Thankfully, both games resist the temptation to use invented military terms, with the soldiers speaking reasonably clear English. The implementation of gravity sections in Killzone 3 is confusing. The gravity is supposedly off, yet you stay attached to the ground, and when you jump you fall back down. However, when you throw a grenade, it'll travel for a bit and then grind to a halt. Then the bodies and dropped equipment, well, they float about and very gradually come to a stop. All three of these implementations are at the same time in the same section. So it seems like no gravity means low gravity for you, no gravity but lots of friction and almost no momentum for thrown objects, and then no gravity and very little friction for other objects. In other words, it isn't very good. The windy items look out of place without Killzone 2's wonderful post-process effects, making everything look, well, windy. Plus, the objects that were copy-pasted into Killzone 3 make little sense outside of a giant high-speed tunnel. Another oddity is the lack of any bonus bits for the single player. Gone are the optional extras like finding intel briefcases or Helghast symbols. Killzone 3 is not as good as Killzone 2, but it is still head and shoulders above most shooters, mostly because you have a head and shoulders, but that isn't saying much, is it? And it does have a pretty good cooperative mode. We have to ask ourselves, is this really worth the investment? The answer is no. Not for full price. Not when Killzone 2 is better in almost every respect.